From the darkest corners of the unknown, where reality bends and the impossible becomes terrifyingly real, come stories that will haunt your dreams and challenge everything you thought you knew about our world. Tonight, we journey into the abyss of human experience, where ordinary people encountered something extraordinary, something that defies explanation and leaves us questioning the very fabric of existence itself. I was working late at the research facility, just another routine night analyzing atmospheric data when the readings started showing impossible numbers. The electromagnetic sensors were going haywire, registering patterns that shouldn't exist in nature. At first, I thought it was equipment failure, but every instrument was telling the same story. Something was out there, something massive, hovering just beyond our detection threshold. The first sign came at 2:47 a.m. when all the lights in the building flickered simultaneously. Not the usual power surge flicker, but a deliberate rhythmic pulsing like a heartbeat made of electricity. I checked the security monitors, and that's when I saw it through the window of camera 12. A faint luminescence in the sky, perfectly geometric, rotating slowly against the starless night. My hands trembled as I reached for the emergency protocols manual. 30 years of scientific training told me to document everything, but every primitive instinct screamed at me to run. The object descended lower, its surface rippling like liquid mercury, reflecting lights that weren't there. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing against the windows with an almost sentient weight. I grabbed the emergency radio to contact the main campus, but only static answered back. Dead silence except for a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from inside my own skull. The fluorescent lights above began to strobe faster now, casting dancing shadows that moved independently of their sources. Through the reinforced glass, I watched as the craft settled into the parking lot with impossible grace. No sound, no wind displacement, no visible means of propulsion. It simply existed where it chose to exist, defying every law of physics I'd spent my career studying. The surface was seamless, organic yet clearly artificial, like technology grown rather than built. That's when the door opened. Not a mechanical hatch or sliding panel, but the hull itself simply parted like water, revealing an interior that glowed with soft, pearl-white light. No heat signature registered on the thermal cameras, no electromagnetic disturbance beyond the initial readings. Whatever materials this thing was constructed from operated on principles we hadn't discovered yet. A figure emerged, tall and impossibly thin, moving with fluid motions that seemed rehearsed yet alien. Its skin reflected the ambient light like polished stone, and where its face should have been was a smooth, featureless surface that somehow conveyed intelligence and purpose. No mouth, no nose, just two dark recesses where eyes might have been, staring directly at the camera, directly at me. I felt a pressure in my mind then, not painful, but insistent, like someone gently knocking on a door I didn't know existed. Images flooded my consciousness. Not my own memories, but something else entirely. Vast cities under foreign stars. Technologies that harvested energy from the quantum foam itself. Civilizations that had transcended physical form millennia ago. The being raised what might have been a hand, and every screen in the facility displayed the same message in perfect English. We have been watching. We have been waiting. The time has come for understanding. The words appeared without sound, without transmission, as if reality itself had been edited to include them. I understood then that this wasn't first contact. This was something far more significant. They had been here all along, observing, cataloging, preparing for this moment when our species would be ready to comprehend what lay beyond our tiny sphere of existence. The research facility, my presence here tonight, even my specific area of expertise, none of it was coincidence. The being gestured toward the building, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to approach. Not mind control, but something deeper, a recognition that this encounter would reshape everything I believed about consciousness, reality, and humanity's place in the cosmic order. My legs moved without conscious command, carrying me toward the exit. Outside, the air tasted different, charged with possibilities that my brain couldn't quite process. The craft loomed larger now, its surface revealing intricate patterns that shifted and flowed like living circuitry. Other figures emerged from the interior, each one unique yet unmistakably part of the same evolutionary path that had carried them far beyond biological limitations. They communicated without words, sharing concepts that bypassed language entirely. I learned that Earth was one of thousands of worlds they monitored, that consciousness itself was the most precious resource in the universe, and that humanity stood at a crossroads between transcendence and extinction. The choice, they implied, was still ours to make. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed negotiable in their presence. They shared technologies that could solve every crisis facing our planet, but with the understanding that knowledge without wisdom was the path to self-destruction. They had seen countless civilizations reach this same threshold, and only a few had chosen wisely. As dawn approached, they prepared to leave. The lead being approached me one final time, and I felt its attention focus on my mind with laser precision. "You will remember," it communicated, "but you will not be believed. This is necessary. Truth must emerge gradually, or it will be rejected entirely." The craft lifted silently into the brightening sky, its form becoming translucent as it rose, eventually becoming indistinguishable from the morning light. I stood alone in the parking lot, clutching a small device they had left behind, its purpose unclear, but its significance undeniable. Back inside the facility, every recording device showed nothing unusual. The electromagnetic readings had returned to normal. The security footage revealed only empty hallways and my own figure walking to and from the exit, but the device remained real and solid in my pocket, warm to the touch and humming with barely contained energy. I never reported the incident officially. Who would believe such an account from a respected atmospheric physicist? Instead, I began researching similar encounters, finding patterns in the data that suggested these visitations were far more common than anyone suspected. The truth was hiding in plain sight, waiting for those with eyes to see. The device they left behind revealed its secrets slowly. It was a data storage unit containing terabytes of information about clean energy, medical breakthroughs, and social technologies that could transform civilization. But accessing it required a level of consciousness I was still developing, a gradual awakening to possibilities beyond our current understanding. That night changed everything for me. I resigned from the facility within a year and dedicated my life to preparing humanity for what was coming. Not invasion or conquest, but invitation. An opportunity to join a galactic community of conscious beings who had learned to transcend the primitive drives that still dominated our species. The signs are everywhere now for those who know how to look. Unexplained phenomena, technological leaps that seem to come from nowhere, and a growing awareness among certain individuals that we are not alone, have never been alone, and are being carefully guided toward our next evolutionary step. They are still watching, still waiting, still hoping that we will prove worthy of the gifts they offer. The question that haunts me every night is whether humanity will recognize the opportunity when it comes, or whether we will retreat into fear and suspicion as we have so many times before. The choice, as they said, remains ours to make, and somewhere in the darkness above, patient and eternal, they continue their vigil, ready to welcome us home to a universe far stranger and more wonderful than we ever dared imagine. But sometimes, the most unsettling encounters aren't the ones that announce themselves with lights in the sky or strange objects in the distance. Sometimes, they're the ones that slip into the ordinary world so quietly, you almost don't notice them at first. Almost. I was working a double shift at the diner, one of those 24-hour places that sits along the interstate where truckers stop for coffee and pie at 3 in the morning. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the bills, and the night shift was usually quiet enough that I could catch up on reading between customers. That particular night was slower than usual. We'd had maybe 6 customers since midnight, and it was already pushing toward 4 a.m., the kind of deep night where time feels thick and every sound echoes a little too long. I was wiping down tables when I heard the bell above the door chime. A woman walked in, tall and thin, wearing a long coat that looked expensive, but somehow out of place. Her hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of position, which struck me as odd for someone traveling at this hour. She moved with this strange, deliberate precision, like each step was carefully calculated. She sat in the corner booth, the one that faces the parking lot, and when I approached with a menu, she looked up at me with eyes that were just a little too wide, a little too bright. Her smile was perfect, but it didn't reach those eyes. "Coffee, please," she said, her voice smooth and measured. "Black." I brought her the coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the mug, but she didn't drink it. She just sat there holding it, staring out the window at the empty parking lot. For the next hour, she didn't move. She didn't shift in her seat, didn't check her phone, didn't even blink as far as I could tell. She just sat there, perfectly still, watching. Other customers came and went. A trucker grabbed a sandwich to go. An elderly man ordered eggs and hash browns. But the woman in the corner booth remained motionless, her coffee growing cold in her hands. Around 5:30, just as the sky was starting to lighten, she finally moved. She stood up, left exact change on the table down to the penny, and walked toward the door. But before she left, she turned back to me. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said, and there was something about the way she said it, like she was reading from a script. "Your kindness will be remembered." She walked out, and I watched through the window as she crossed the parking lot. But here's the thing that still gives me chills. She didn't get into a car. She just kept walking, straight across the lot, past the gas pumps, and into the darkness beyond the interstate. In that long coat and heels, she walked into the middle of nowhere like she knew exactly where she was going. I found out later that 3 other diners along that same stretch of highway had the same visitor that night. A woman in an expensive coat, ordering black coffee, sitting perfectly still for hours, then walking away into the darkness. All of them left exact change. All of them said the exact same thing about kindness being remembered. The security cameras caught her entering each location, but none of them showed her leaving. The footage just showed empty booths where she'd been sitting, like she'd simply vanished. What disturbs me most isn't the strangeness of her behavior or the way she disappeared. It's the feeling I had while she was there, like I was being evaluated, like every interaction, every gesture, every word was being carefully noted and filed away somewhere. She said my kindness would be remembered, but remembered by whom? And for what purpose? These encounters force us to question the boundaries of what we consider normal, what we accept as possible. They remind us that our world might be far stranger and more populated than we ever imagined, that we might not be alone, and that we might not be the ones in control. The beings in these stories don't always come with flashing lights or dramatic entrances. Sometimes they slip into our world quietly, observing, learning, preparing. They sit in our diners, walk through our forests, hover above our lakes. They're there in the spaces between what we know and what we fear to know. And perhaps most unsettling of all, they seem to be waiting for something. Whether it's the right moment to make contact, the right conditions to reveal themselves, or something else entirely, we can only guess. But one thing is certain: they're watching, they're learning, and they're far more patient than we could ever imagine. The question isn't whether these encounters are real. The question is what happens next. What happens when the observation period ends? What happens when they decide we're ready, or when they determine that we're not? Until then, we're left with these stories, these glimpses into a reality that exists just beyond the edge of our understanding. Stories that remind us that we're not alone in this vast universe, and that sometimes the most profound encounters happen not with a bang, but with a whisper in the darkness. The universe is full of mysteries, and some of those mysteries are watching us back, there in the quiet moments, the ordinary places, the spaces where we least expect them. And they're waiting. Sweet dreams. I was stationed at a remote research facility in Alaska when it happened, the kind of place where the nearest town is 200 miles away, and the only sounds at night are the wind and the occasional crack of shifting ice. I'd been there for 3 months, part of a small team studying atmospheric conditions. Nothing glamorous, just collecting data and sending reports back to headquarters every few days. The work was routine, predictable even. That's what made what happened so unsettling. It started with the dogs. The facility kept a small pack of sled dogs, maybe 8 or 9 of them, housed in a kennel about 50 yards from the main building. These weren't pets. They were working animals, tough and resilient. They'd been through Arctic storms, sub-zero temperatures, and encounters with polar bears without so much as a whimper. But that night, they wouldn't stop howling. At first, I thought maybe there was a predator nearby. Bears, wolves, something that had caught their scent. But this wasn't the kind of howling you'd hear when they sensed danger. This was different. Mournful. Almost like they were in pain. It went on for hours, starting just after sunset and continuing well into the night. I tried to ignore it, focus on my work, but the sound was relentless. Around midnight, I decided to check on them. I threw on my parka and stepped outside into the frigid air. The temperature was brutal, maybe 30 below, and the wind cut through my layers like they weren't even there. The dogs were huddled together in their pen, all of them facing the same direction, staring out toward the frozen lake that stretched beyond the facility. Their howling had stopped the moment I stepped outside, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the cold. I followed their gaze toward the lake, but all I could see was endless white under the pale moonlight. Nothing moving, nothing out of place. Just the stark, desolate landscape that had become my world for the past few months. But the dogs remained motionless, their attention fixed on something I couldn't see. That's when I noticed the lights. They were faint at first, barely visible against the snow. 3 points of soft, amber light arranged in a perfect triangle, hovering just above the surface of the frozen lake. They didn't flicker or pulse like aircraft lights would. They were steady, constant, like stars that had descended from the sky. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the cold was playing tricks on my eyes, but the lights remained. I went back inside and grabbed my binoculars, my hands already starting to numb despite my gloves. Through the lenses, the lights became clearer, more defined. They were definitely there, definitely real, and they were moving. Slowly, deliberately, the triangle of lights began to drift across the lake toward the facility. There was no sound, no disturbance of the snow beneath them, just 3 points of light gliding silently through the Arctic night. My first instinct was to wake the others, but something held me back. Maybe it was the way the dogs had gone completely silent, or the strange sense of calm that had settled over the landscape. Whatever it was, I felt like I was meant to witness this alone. The lights continued their approach, growing larger and brighter as they drew closer. When they were maybe 100 yards away, I could make out the faint outline of something solid between them. It wasn't a craft in any conventional sense, more like a shadow given form. A darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it rather than reflect it. The amber lights appeared to be attached to its corners, or maybe they were part of it entirely. As it drew nearer, I felt a strange pressure in my head, like the air itself was thickening. My ears popped, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. But then the pressure lifted, replaced by something else entirely. Thoughts that weren't my own began to filter into my consciousness. Not words exactly, but concepts, ideas, emotions that felt foreign, yet somehow familiar. Curiosity, that was the strongest impression I received. Whatever this thing was, it was curious about us, about our presence in this remote corner of the world. There was no malevolence in the thoughts, no sense of threat or danger. Just an overwhelming desire to understand, to observe, to learn. The object came to a stop directly above the facility, maybe 50 feet overhead. The amber lights cast long shadows across the snow, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. The dogs had begun to whimper softly, not in fear, but in something that almost resembled awe. I don't know how long we stayed like that, the object hovering silently above while I stood transfixed in the snow below. Time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously, minutes feeling like hours, while hours passed like seconds. But gradually, the pressure in my head began to ease, and the foreign thoughts faded from my mind. The object began to rise, the amber lights growing dimmer as it ascended into the star-filled sky. Within moments, it had disappeared entirely, leaving no trace of its presence, except for the lingering sense that something profound had just occurred. I stood there for a long time after it was gone, staring up at the empty sky and trying to process what I'd experienced. The dogs had settled down, curling up in their shelter as if nothing had happened. The wind had died to a whisper, and the Arctic silence felt deeper than ever before. When I finally went back inside, I found that all of our equipment had recorded the same thing. Nothing. No electromagnetic anomalies, no temperature fluctuations, no atmospheric disturbances. According to our instruments, the night had been completely normal, but I knew what I'd seen, what I'd felt, and no amount of scientific data could convince me otherwise. I never told the others about that night. How could I? They would have thought the isolation was getting to me, that the endless darkness and bitter cold had finally driven me over the edge. But sometimes, on particularly clear nights, I would step outside and scan the sky, hoping to catch another glimpse of those amber lights. The facility was shut down 2 months later, budget cuts, they said, and we were all relocated to different assignments. I've never been back to that remote corner of Alaska, but I often wonder if the object ever returned. If it's still out there, drifting silently across the frozen landscape, driven by that same overwhelming curiosity that I felt pressing against my mind that night. What troubles me most isn't what I saw, but what it might have seen in return. What conclusions did it draw about us? What did it learn from its silent observation of our small outpost in the wilderness? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what did it decide to do with that knowledge? The Arctic is vast and empty, a place where the line between reality and imagination can become dangerously thin. But some experiences transcend explanation, leaving you with the unshakable certainty that we are not alone in this universe, that somewhere out there in the cold depths of space, something is watching us with the same curious intensity that we reserve for studying insects under a microscope. I've tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by isolation and extreme cold. but the memory remains as vivid today as it was that night, burned into my consciousness like a brand. The amber lights, the pressure in my head, the foreign thoughts that felt so distinctly other. These details haven't faded or distorted with time. If anything, they've become clearer, more precise. Sometimes I wonder if that's part of their design. If whatever intelligence guided that object wanted to ensure I would remember, that I would carry the memory with me, a living record of our encounter that no amount of scientific skepticism could erase, a reminder that the universe is far stranger and more populated than we dare to imagine. I never thought I'd find myself in the middle of nowhere at 3 a.m, but there I was, standing outside what used to be the Riverside Medical Center. The place had been abandoned for 15 years, ever since the state shut it down for what they called budgetary concerns. But locals knew better. They knew about the strange incidents, the unexplained disappearances, the lights that still flickered in empty rooms long after the power had been cut. My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm a paranormal investigator. I don't usually work alone, but my partner Marcus had come down with food poisoning the night before our planned investigation. I should have postponed the whole thing, but something about this place had been calling to me for weeks. The reports were too consistent, too detailed to ignore. The building loomed against the starless sky like a broken tooth. 5 stories of cracked concrete and shattered windows, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut open in so many places, it was basically decorative. I squeezed through one of the gaps, my equipment bag catching on the twisted metal. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint and debris scattered across the linoleum floors. I'd studied the building's layout extensively. The reports all centered around the 4th floor, specifically the old pediatric ward. That's where I needed to go. The elevator shaft gaped open like a hungry mouth, so I took the stairs. Each step echoed in the silence, and more than once I found myself pausing to listen for sounds that weren't there. On the 2nd floor, I noticed something strange. The walls were covered in what looked like handprints, but they were too large, the fingers too long. The marks appeared to be burned into the surface, as if someone had pressed red-hot hands against the paint. By the 3rd floor, my equipment started acting up. The EMF detector, which had been silent since I entered the building, suddenly began chirping erratically. The needle swung wildly back and forth before settling on a reading I'd never seen before. It was off the charts, literally beyond what the device was designed to measure. When I reached the 4th floor, everything went quiet. Not just quiet, silent in a way that felt unnatural. The EMF detector stopped chirping. My footsteps seemed muffled, as if the air itself was absorbing sound. Even my own breathing sounded distant and hollow. The pediatric ward stretched out before me, a long corridor lined with empty rooms. Some still had their doors, hanging open at odd angles. Others were just dark rectangles leading into deeper darkness. I started checking rooms systematically, documenting everything with my camera and voice recorder. It was in the 7th room that I found them. At first, I thought they were mannequins. 3 small figures sitting in the corner, their backs to the door. They were perfectly still, arranged in a neat row as if waiting for something. But as my flashlight beam settled on them, I realized they weren't mannequins at all. They were children, or they had been children once. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, with a faint bluish tint that reminded me of skim milk. They wore hospital gowns that were too clean, too white for a place that had been abandoned for 15 years, but it was their eyes that made my blood freeze. Large, dark, and completely black. No iris, no pupil, just solid obsidian orbs that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. One of them turned its head toward me with a motion that was too smooth, too fluid. Its mouth opened, and when it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the air around me had turned to molasses, thick and resistant. The other two figures began to turn as well. Their movements synchronized, like dancers following choreography only they could hear. "We've been waiting," the second one said. "Waiting so long," added the third. They stood up in unison, and I realized they were floating slightly above the floor. Their feet didn't quite touch the ground, and they moved toward me with that same eerie grace. My camera was still running, still recording, but when I glanced at the LCD screen, all I saw was static. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. The first child tilted its head at an impossible angle. "We are the bridge," it said. "The space between what was and what will be. The doctors brought us here," the second one continued. "They promised to make us better. But better meant different," the third added. Different meant empty. As they spoke, images began flashing in my mind. I saw the hospital as it had been years ago, bustling with activity. I saw children being brought in, sick children with terminal illnesses and rare conditions. I saw doctors in white coats making promises to desperate parents. I saw underground laboratories hidden beneath the building's foundation, and I saw the experiments. The children moved closer, and the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost began forming on the windows. They weren't malevolent, I realized. They were lost, trapped between worlds, neither alive nor dead, victims of something far worse than any disease. "They changed us," the first child said, and now I could see tears streaming down its pale cheeks. "Made us into something else, something that could see beyond the veil." "We see them now," the second one whispered. "The Watchers, the ones who have always been here." "They're coming," the third added, "coming for all of you." The room began to spin, or maybe I was spinning. The walls seemed to stretch and bend, and through the cracks in reality, I caught glimpses of something vast and alien, shapes that hurt to look at directly, geometries that shouldn't exist, and eyes, so many eyes, watching from the spaces between dimensions. "Run," the first child said, and suddenly I could move again, run before they see you too. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted from the room, my equipment bag bouncing against my hip as I sprinted down the corridor. Behind me, I could hear something that might have been laughter or might have been screaming. The building itself seemed to be groaning, as if the very structure was in pain. I made it to the stairwell and took the steps 3 at a time. On the second floor, the handprints on the walls were glowing now, pulsing with a sickly green light. The first floor stretched out impossibly long, the exit door seeming to recede even as I ran toward it. When I finally burst through the entrance and into the night air, I kept running until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I looked back once in my rearview mirror. The building was blazing with light. Every window glowed with that same green radiance, and shadows moved behind the glass. Not the shadows of the children, but something else. Something larger and more terrible. When I got home, I tried to review my footage. The camera had recorded everything, but not what I had seen. Instead, it showed me standing alone in an empty room, talking to nothing, backing away from empty air. The audio was worse. My voice was there, asking questions, but the responses were just silence broken by a low humming sound that seemed to burrow into my skull. I never went back to the Riverside Medical Center. 3 weeks later, it burned down under mysterious circumstances. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but there hadn't been electricity in that building for 15 years. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming sound. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I catch glimpses of pale figures in my peripheral vision. Children who aren't quite children anymore, trying to warn me about something I'm not sure I want to understand. The Watchers are still out there, still waiting, still preparing for something that's coming whether we're ready or not. And I have the terrible feeling that what happened at that hospital was just the beginning. They're testing us, learning from us, and when they're done gathering their data, they'll make their move. The children tried to warn me, but I'm starting to think it might already be too late. The bridge has been built, the space between worlds is getting thinner, and soon, very soon, we're all going to see what's been watching us from the other side. As the veil between worlds grows thin, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of encounters that defy explanation. In remote corners of our world, where silence weighs heavy and shadows dance beyond the reach of understanding, ordinary people have witnessed the extraordinary. Tonight, we delve deeper into these mysteries, where the familiar becomes foreign and the impossible whispers its presence through the darkness. The desert stretches endlessly beneath a canopy of ancient stars, its vastness holding secrets that few dare to seek. Dr. Sarah Chen had devoted her career to studying atmospheric phenomena, but nothing in her extensive training had prepared her for what she would discover during a routine research expedition in Nevada's most isolated region. It began with readings that made no sense. Her instruments, calibrated to detect the subtlest changes in electromagnetic fields, began registering patterns that seemed to pulse with deliberate intent. The data suggested something massive was influencing the local environment, yet visual scans revealed nothing but empty desert stretching to the horizon. On the third night of her study, as she sat alone in her research trailer analyzing the day's findings, the equipment suddenly went silent. Every gauge, every monitor, every carefully calibrated instrument fell dormant, as if responding to some unseen command. The silence that followed wasn't merely the absence of sound, but something deeper, more profound, as though the very air had forgotten how to carry vibration. When she stepped outside to check the external sensors, Sarah found herself beneath a sky that had transformed. The familiar constellations remained, but between them, geometric patterns of light moved with purposeful grace. These weren't aircraft or satellites. They were something else entirely, weaving through the darkness with movements too fluid and coordinated to be of human origin. The patterns seemed to respond to her presence, shifting their configuration when she moved, maintaining a precise distance that suggested both awareness and intent. For nearly an hour she stood transfixed as these lights performed what could only be described as a dance, their movements creating shapes that felt almost linguistic, as if they were attempting to communicate in a visual language beyond human comprehension. When the lights finally faded, dissolving into the star-filled sky like memories returning to dreams, Sarah discovered that her instruments had recorded everything. The electromagnetic signatures revealed intelligence patterns unlike anything in the scientific literature, suggesting technologies that operated on principles humanity had yet to discover. Far from the desert's isolation, in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a different kind of encounter was unfolding. Marcus Rivera, a wildlife photographer accustomed to the forest's rhythms and secrets, had ventured deep into old-growth timber to document the migration patterns of local fauna. The forest held an unusual stillness that evening, as if every creature had simultaneously decided to hold its breath. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the ancient trees, leaving Marcus alone with only the soft crunch of pine needles beneath his feet. He had been tracking what appeared to be unusual animal movements when he noticed the trees themselves seemed to be responding to something his senses couldn't detect. Through his telephoto lens, Marcus first spotted the figure moving between the massive trunks. It appeared humanoid but wrong in ways that made his mind struggle to process what he was seeing. The proportions were off, too tall and too thin, with limbs that bent at angles that human anatomy shouldn't allow. Its movement was completely silent, gliding rather than walking, leaving no trace of its passage on the forest floor. When the figure paused and turned toward his hiding spot, Marcus felt the weight of its attention like a physical presence. Though he couldn't make out distinct features through the camera's viewfinder, he sensed an intelligence that was both ancient and utterly alien. For several minutes, they observed each other across the shadowed space between the trees, predator and prey, uncertain which role belonged to whom. The figure eventually continued its path deeper into the forest, but not before Marcus captured several photographs that would later defy explanation. The images showed distortions in the light around the entity, as if its very presence bent reality in subtle but unmistakable ways. These encounters, separated by thousands of miles and vastly different environments, share common threads that weave through countless similar reports from around the world. Witnesses describe a sense of being observed by intelligences that operate according to rules we don't yet understand, entities that seem to exist just beyond the edge of our perception, yet occasionally allow themselves to be glimpsed. The electromagnetic anomalies detected by Dr. Chen mirror phenomena reported at sites across the globe, suggesting technologies that manipulate the fundamental forces of nature with an elegance that makes our most advanced systems seem primitive by comparison. The entity Marcus photographed belongs to a category of sightings that span cultures and continents, describing beings whose very existence challenges our understanding of what life can become. What emerges from these accounts is not merely evidence of the unknown, but a glimpse into realities that exist parallel to our own. These witnesses have peered through cracks in the fabric of the familiar world and seen something vast and incomprehensible looking back. Their experiences suggest that we share this universe with intelligences so advanced, so fundamentally different from ourselves, that contact between our species may be as challenging for them as it is transformative for us. As we continue to collect these testimonies, patterns emerge that point toward a truth both humbling and extraordinary. We are not alone, and those who share this cosmos with us possess capabilities that reduce our greatest achievements to the first tentative steps of a species still learning to see beyond the boundaries of its own small world. The encounters continue, each one adding another piece to a puzzle that spans the breadth of human experience and reaches toward mysteries that may forever remain just beyond our complete understanding. Yet in that reaching, in that willingness to acknowledge what we cannot yet explain, we take the first steps toward a larger truth about our place in the infinite expanse of existence. I was stationed at Edwards Air Force Base back in 1987, working night communications in a bunker about 3 miles from the main runway. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly monitoring radio chatter and weather data, but it kept me busy during those long desert nights. The facility was isolated, surrounded by nothing but scrub brush and endless darkness. Most nights passed without incident, just the occasional test flight or routine maintenance check-ins. This particular night started like any other. I was alone in the communications room, a cramped space filled with aging radio equipment and blinking monitors. The air conditioning hummed constantly, fighting against the desert heat that lingered even after sunset. Around 2:30 a.m., I noticed something strange on the radar display. There was a contact moving at impossible speeds, appearing and disappearing across the screen in patterns that defied every law of physics I knew. At first, I thought it was equipment malfunction. Our gear was old, prone to glitches, and the isolation played tricks on your mind. But this was different. The contact wasn't random static or electronic interference. It moved with purpose, intelligence, following flight patterns that suggested conscious control. I called it in to the tower, but they showed nothing on their screens. According to them, the skies were completely clear. I watched the anomalous reading for nearly an hour. It would appear at one edge of the radar, streak across the display faster than any known aircraft, then vanish completely before reappearing somewhere else entirely. The movements were too precise, too coordinated to be natural phenomena or equipment failure. Whatever this was, it was real, and it was unlike anything in our arsenal. Around 3:45 a.m., all our communications equipment went dead. Every radio, every monitor, every piece of electronic equipment in the bunker simply shut off. The silence was deafening. Even the air conditioning stopped, leaving me in complete darkness and an eerie quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. I fumbled for the emergency flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The backup generators should have kicked in automatically, but nothing happened. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a metal box in the middle of the desert with no way to contact anyone. The flashlight beam seemed weak against the overwhelming darkness, barely illuminating the dead control panels around me. That's when I heard it, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't a sound you heard with your ears so much as felt in your bones. A vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The metal walls of the bunker began to vibrate in harmony with the sound, creating an otherworldly symphony that grew louder and more intense with each passing second. I pressed myself against the far wall, flashlight clutched in trembling hands, as the humming reached a crescendo that threatened to drive me insane. The beam of my light began to flicker and dim, as if whatever was causing this phenomenon was draining power from everything around it. Through the small observation window, I could see a faint glow emanating from outside, casting strange shadows that moved independently of any visible source. The humming stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sound itself. I stood frozen, barely breathing, waiting for something to happen. My watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 3:52 a.m. Time itself seemed suspended in that moment, as if the normal rules of reality had been temporarily suspended. Slowly, carefully, I made my way to the observation window. The desert outside was bathed in an ethereal blue-white light that had no apparent source. It wasn't moonlight or starlight, but something else entirely, something that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. The landscape looked alien under this strange illumination, familiar landmarks transformed into something otherworldly and menacing. Then I saw them. 3 figures moving across the desert floor with an unnaturally smooth gait, as if they were gliding rather than walking. They were tall, impossibly thin, with elongated limbs that bent at angles that hurt to look at. Their skin, if it could be called that, seemed to absorb and reflect the strange light simultaneously, making them appear both solid and translucent. The figures moved with obvious purpose, heading directly toward the bunker. As they drew closer, I could see that they had no faces in any conventional sense, just smooth surfaces where features should have been. Yet I felt their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They knew I was there, watching them, and they were coming for me. I backed away from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The metal door of the bunker, which had always seemed so solid and secure, now felt like paper-thin protection against whatever was approaching. I could hear them now, or rather feel them, their presence pressing against the walls like a physical weight. The door handle began to turn, slowly, deliberately, with no accompanying sound of footsteps or voices. I raised the flashlight like a weapon, though I knew it would be useless against whatever was coming through that door. The beam wavered as my hands shook, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move with malevolent intent. The door opened silently on its hinges. No figure appeared in the doorway, but the temperature in the bunker dropped dramatically. My breath came out in visible puffs as frost began to form on the metal surfaces around me. The strange blue light filtered in from outside, bringing with it a presence that felt ancient and utterly alien. I felt, rather than saw them enter, the air became thick, oppressive, filled with an intelligence that was vast and incomprehensible. My flashlight beam passed through empty space, but I knew they were there, studying me with the detached curiosity of scientists examining a specimen. The feeling of being utterly helpless, completely at their mercy, was overwhelming. Then, without warning, images flooded my mind. Not pictures exactly, but concepts, emotions, fragments of knowledge that my brain struggled to process. I saw vast cities among the stars, civilizations that had risen and fallen before humanity had even learned to make fire. I felt the loneliness of endless journeys through the void, the weight of knowledge accumulated across eons of existence. They weren't hostile, I realized. They were explorers, observers, travelers from places so distant that the very concepts of space and time became meaningless. They had been watching us for longer than our species had existed, documenting our progress with the patience of beings for whom millennia passed like days. The communication, if it could be called that, lasted only moments. Then the presence withdrew, leaving me gasping and disoriented in the suddenly empty bunker. The strange light faded, the temperature returned to normal, and gradually, one by one, the electronic systems began to power back up. The familiar hum of the air conditioning resumed, and the radio crackled back to life. I staggered to the radar display, but it showed nothing unusual. The skies were clear, empty of any contacts. My watch was working again, showing 4:15 a.m., though I could have sworn the entire encounter lasted hours. The only evidence that anything had happened was a thin layer of frost on the metal surfaces, which melted quickly in the desert heat. I filed a report the next morning, as protocol demanded. Within hours, men in dark suits arrived to debrief me. They listened to my account with poker faces, took my written statement, and then classified the entire incident. I was transferred to a different base within the week, ostensibly for routine rotation, but I knew better. That was over 30 years ago, but I still remember every detail of that night. The humming sound, the impossible light, the feeling of being in the presence of something infinitely older and wiser than humanity. I've never spoken publicly about it until now, but with my retirement from the service, I feel compelled to share what I experienced. Sometimes, late at night, I think I can still hear that humming sound, faint and distant, but unmistakably the same. I wonder if they're still out there, still watching, still documenting our species' slow progress towards something greater. The thought should be terrifying, but somehow it's oddly comforting. We're not alone in this vast universe, and perhaps someday we'll be ready to join that ancient community of travelers among the stars. Until then, they wait, patient and eternal, guardians of knowledge we can't yet comprehend. And occasionally, just occasionally, they reach out to remind us that there are mysteries in this universe far greater than anything we can imagine. The forest was silent that night, unnaturally so. I was camped about 15 miles from the nearest trailhead, deep in the Cascades where most hikers never venture. It was late October, the kind of cold that bites through your sleeping bag no matter how well you've prepared. I'd been photographing the old growth for a documentary project, trying to capture something authentic before the logging permits went through. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to what I can only describe as a presence, not a sound, not a movement, just this overwhelming sense that something massive was nearby, watching. The air felt different, heavier somehow, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. But the sky was clear when I unzipped my tent. That's when I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet away. They were tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, but with proportions that seemed wrong. Too thin, too angular. Their skin had this pale, almost translucent quality that seemed to catch what little starlight filtered through the canopy. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just stood there observing. I reached for my camera, hand shaking. The digital display flickered strangely, the usual green glow replaced by this pulsing amber light. When I looked through the viewfinder, the figures appeared different. Not clearer, but somehow more present, as if the camera was seeing something my naked eye couldn't fully process. Their faces were elongated, with features that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. One of them raised what might have been an arm. The gesture was slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. And then I heard it, not with my ears, but somewhere deeper, like a vibration in my chest. It wasn't language as we understand it, but somehow I knew they were trying to communicate. Images flashed through my mind, landscapes I'd never seen, structures that defied physics, and an overwhelming sense of time, vast stretches of it that made my human lifespan feel like a single breath. They showed me the forest as it had been before humans arrived, before the first Native Americans crossed the land bridge. Ancient beyond measure, these trees had been saplings when their kind first visited Earth. They'd been watching, waiting, documenting the slow changes as life evolved and civilizations rose and fell. We weren't the first intelligent species they'd encountered here, but we might be the last. The communication lasted only moments, but it felt like hours. When it ended, the figures began to fade, not walking away but becoming increasingly transparent until they simply weren't there anymore. The forest sounds returned gradually, as if nature itself had been holding its breath during the encounter. I checked my camera's memory card the next morning. The photos were there, but they were different from what I remembered capturing. Instead of the tall figures, the images showed orbs of light, geometric patterns that seemed to move when I looked at them sideways. The metadata was corrupted, showing impossible timestamps and GPS coordinates that placed me simultaneously in 3 different locations. I never finished the documentary project. How could I explain what I'd experienced without sounding like another delusional conspiracy theorist? But I kept the photos, and sometimes late at night when the world is quiet, I study them and remember that feeling of being seen, truly seen, by intelligence so vast and ancient that our entire recorded history is just a footnote in their observations. They're still out there, in the deep places where humans rarely go, watching, waiting, perhaps trying to decide if we're worth preserving or if we're just another failed experiment in consciousness. Sometimes I think about returning to that clearing, but I know they'll find me when they're ready. Until then, I carry their message in my bones, a reminder that we are not alone, and we never have been. The forest remembers everything, and so do they. I was working as a radio operator at a communications facility deep in the Montana wilderness when the transmission started coming through. It wasn't my first assignment in the middle of nowhere, but this place felt different from the moment I arrived. The facility was small, just a handful of buildings surrounded by dense forest and mountains that seemed to swallow sound itself. My job was straightforward: monitor incoming signals, log routine communications, and maintain contact with various government agencies. Most nights were quiet, filled with the usual chatter from weather stations, air traffic control, and the occasional emergency broadcast. I'd grown accustomed to the isolation, even found it peaceful in a way that city life never was. The first strange transmission came through on a Tuesday night around 2:30 in the morning. I was half dozing at my station when a signal broke through on a frequency that wasn't supposed to carry anything. It wasn't the usual static or interference you'd expect from equipment malfunction. This was deliberate, structured, almost musical in its rhythm. The transmission lasted exactly 47 seconds. I know because I timed it, thinking it might be some kind of test signal or coded message from another facility. But when I checked the logs the next morning, there was no record of any scheduled transmissions on that frequency. According to our systems, nothing had come through at all. I mentioned it to my supervisor during the shift change, but he brushed it off as atmospheric interference. "Equipment gets weird signals sometimes," he said, "especially this far from civilization. Radio waves bounce off the ionosphere in strange ways, pick up distant broadcasts from halfway around the world." It happens. But it kept happening. Every few nights, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, that same frequency would come alive with transmissions that shouldn't exist. They weren't random bursts of noise or distant radio stations bleeding through. These signals had structure, purpose, like a language I couldn't understand but somehow felt familiar. I started recording them without telling anyone. The facility had strict protocols about unauthorized recordings, but something about these transmissions compelled me to document them. Each one was different in length and pattern, but they all shared that same musical quality, like hearing a conversation through water. After 2 weeks of recordings, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The transmissions were responding to each other. Not immediately, but over the course of several nights, patterns would emerge that seemed like responses to previous signals. It was as if multiple sources were communicating with each other, using our equipment as some kind of relay station. The realization hit me during one particularly clear transmission that lasted nearly 3 minutes. As I listened to the flowing melodic tones, I started hearing fragments that sounded almost like human speech, not words exactly, but inflections and rhythms that reminded me of conversation. It was like listening to people talk in a room next door, catching the cadence without understanding the content. That's when I made my first mistake. I tried to respond. Using the same frequency, I transmitted a simple pattern back. 3 short bursts, pause, 3 more bursts. Basic Morse code for the letter S, repeated twice. I figured if something was using our equipment to communicate, maybe it would recognize an attempt at contact. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every piece of equipment in the facility began receiving signals simultaneously. Not just the radio equipment, but computers, phones, even the microwave in the break room started picking up transmissions. The cacophony was deafening, layer upon layer of those musical tones flooding through every electronic device we had. It lasted exactly 90 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Every screen in the facility displayed the same thing, a slowly pulsing pattern of lights that seemed to shift and move like something alive. I called my supervisor immediately, but when he arrived 20 minutes later, everything had returned to normal. The screens showed standard displays, the equipment functioned normally, and there was no record in any of our systems of the massive signal burst I'd experienced. According to the automated logs, nothing unusual had happened at all. He listened to my explanation with growing skepticism, especially when I mentioned trying to respond to the mysterious transmissions. Protocol violations were serious business, and unauthorized transmissions could result in immediate termination and federal charges. But when I tried to play back my recordings of the original signals, the files were empty. Hours of carefully documented transmissions had been reduced to silence. Over the next few days, the facility felt different. Equipment that had always been reliable started experiencing intermittent problems. Computers would freeze for exactly 47 seconds before resuming normal operation. Radio receivers would spontaneously tune themselves to empty frequencies. The building's electrical system developed an odd humming sound that seemed to move through the walls like something alive. But the strangest change was in the silence. The facility had always been quiet, but now the silence felt expectant, like the moment before someone speaks. I found myself listening constantly, waiting for something I couldn't name. Sleep became difficult, not because of noise, but because of how complete the quiet had become. The second wave of transmissions began a week later, but these were different. Instead of the musical tones I'd grown accustomed to, these signals carried something that sounded disturbingly like human voices. Not speaking words in any language I recognized, but using vocal patterns that were unmistakably human in origin. The voices were discussing something. That much was clear from their conversational tone and rhythm. Sometimes they seemed to be asking questions, other times making statements or observations. Occasionally, one voice would repeat something another had said, like they were confirming information or teaching each other. What unsettled me most was how familiar some of the vocal patterns sounded. Inflections and speech rhythms that reminded me of conversations I'd had, people I'd known, ways of speaking that felt personal and specific. It was as if something was learning to mimic human communication by studying recordings of actual people. I started paying closer attention to my colleagues, listening to how they spoke, and comparing it to the patterns I heard in the transmissions. The similarities were subtle but undeniable. A particular way of pausing before making a point, a specific rhythm when asking questions, vocal habits that were distinctly human and distinctly familiar. The realization that something was studying us, learning from us, using our own communication methods to practice some unknowable form of contact, left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. Every conversation felt like it might be monitored, every word potentially recorded and analyzed by intelligences that existed beyond our understanding. 3 weeks after the transmissions began, they stopped completely. The frequency fell silent, and the equipment returned to its normal, reliable operation. But the feeling of being watched never left. Even now, months later, and working at a different facility hundreds of miles away, I sometimes catch myself listening to the static between radio stations, waiting for those musical tones to return. I never found out what those transmissions were or where they came from. The official reports classified the incidents as equipment malfunctions caused by atmospheric conditions and solar activity. But I know what I heard, and I know that something out there was using our technology to study us, to learn from us, and perhaps to prepare for something we couldn't imagine. The most disturbing part isn't that they were watching us. It's that they stopped. Whatever they needed to learn, whatever information they were gathering, they got it. And now, in the silence that followed, I can't help but wonder what comes next. Sometimes, late at night when I'm monitoring the empty frequencies, I think about that moment when I tried to make contact, the overwhelming response, the way every piece of equipment suddenly came alive with signals that seemed almost excited, almost grateful for acknowledgement. It was as if something had been waiting patiently for us to notice, and when we finally did, it was overjoyed to respond. But joy from what kind of intelligence? And what did our brief moment of contact set in motion? These are questions that keep me awake during the quiet hours, listening to static and wondering if somewhere in that white noise, patient voices are still learning, still preparing, still watching from the spaces between our signals. Part 9. The Watchers in the Static. As dawn approached, Detective Sarah Chen found herself staring at the case files scattered across her desk, each one more impossible than the last. For 3 months, reports had been flooding in from across the county. Witnesses describing encounters that defied every logical explanation she'd learned in her 15 years on the force. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Sarah barely noticed. Her attention was fixed on the testimonies, each one eerily consistent despite coming from people who had never met, lived in different towns, and had no reason to coordinate their stories. There was Marcus, the night shift pharmacist who described pale customers requesting medications that didn't exist, people who moved too smoothly and read his thoughts. His security footage showed normal customers during the day, but the late-night visitors appeared distorted on camera, their faces blurred as if the lens couldn't quite focus on them. Then there was Elena, the single mother who claimed alien voices had chosen her as an ambassador. Her 7-year-old son had started drawing pictures of tall, thin figures with elongated limbs, the same figures described in a dozen other reports. When Sarah interviewed the boy, he spoke matter-of-factly about Mommy's friends who live in her head, describing details no child should know. The violinist, David Kim, had brought recordings of impossible music that seemed to shift and change each time Sarah listened to them. The melodies were hauntingly beautiful, but followed no earthly musical theory. Audio analysis showed frequencies that shouldn't exist, harmonics that created patterns in the brainwaves of anyone who heard them. Sarah rubbed her tired eyes and reached for another file. Dr. William Hayes, the archaeologist, had discovered documents in an ancient chamber that appeared to be a treaty between humans and something else, beings from beyond Earth who had agreed to leave under specific conditions. The symbols on the documents moved when photographed, rearranging themselves into new patterns that seemed to respond to whoever was reading them. The astronaut's report was perhaps the most disturbing. Commander Rodriguez described a massive craft that had pulled his shuttle into some kind of void, where beings of pure light had communicated without words. His crew's memories of the event were fragmented, but all 4 men had returned with the same inexplicable knowledge, star charts of systems that hadn't been discovered yet, and a deep, unshakable certainty that something was coming. Each case seemed isolated at first, but patterns were emerging. The encounters always happened during specific time windows, usually between 2 and 4 a.m. Witnesses described similar beings, tall, thin, with smooth skin that seemed to shift like liquid metal. Electronic devices malfunctioned during the encounters, creating gaps in recordings and corrupted data that made official documentation nearly impossible. What troubled Sarah most was the consistency of the message. Across dozens of testimonies, witnesses reported the same underlying communication. The Watchers had been here for millennia, observing humanity's development. They weren't hostile, but they weren't benevolent either. They were conducting some kind of long-term study, and recent events suggested their patience was wearing thin. The social media influencer, Jessica Park, had experienced something that chilled Sarah to the bone. Her followers had grown exponentially after posting about dreams of a blue room filled with watching figures. The algorithm seemed to be amplifying her content in ways that defied explanation, as if something was using the platform to identify and connect people who had similar experiences. Then there were the pilots. 3 separate military aviators had reported encounters with craft that moved in ways that violated the laws of physics. The objects didn't just fly, they seemed to exist partially outside normal space, appearing and disappearing at will, matching the movements of human aircraft with impossible precision. Sarah picked up the phone to call her supervisor, then set it down again. How could she explain this to Captain Morrison? That every impossible story was starting to fit together into something larger? That the evidence, while circumstantial, pointed to a reality that would shatter everything people believed about humanity's place in the universe. The cancer patient's testimony haunted her most of all. Thomas Brennan had been offered a cure by something that wasn't human, but the price would have been his very essence, his humanity. He'd chosen to remain himself, to face death on his own terms, rather than become something else. The tumor had shrunk anyway, as if his refusal had somehow earned their respect. A soft knock on her office door interrupted her thoughts. Officer Martinez peered in, looking concerned. "Detective Chen, you've been here all night. Everything okay?" Sarah looked up, realizing how she must appear, disheveled, surrounded by files that read like science fiction, staring at evidence that no court would ever accept. "Martinez, have you ever wondered if we're alone in the universe?" The young officer shifted uncomfortably. "I guess everyone has at some point. Why?" Sarah gestured at the files. "What if we're not? What if we never have been? What if something has been watching us, studying us, for thousands of years?" Martinez stepped into the office, closing the door behind him. "Detective, when's the last time you went home? Got some sleep?" Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sleep doesn't help when you realize the world isn't what you thought it was. Look at these reports, Martinez. Really look at them. Different witnesses, different locations, different times, but the same story over and over again. She spread out the photographs, the audio recordings, the sketches. They're not random encounters. They're part of something bigger, a pattern that's been going on for decades, maybe centuries, and I think it's accelerating. Martinez studied the files, his expression growing more serious. "Detective, even if all this is true, what are we supposed to do about it? We're local police. This is way above our pay grade." "That's just it," Sarah said, leaning back in her chair. "I don't think the higher-ups don't know. I think they've known all along. Every time I try to escalate these reports, they disappear into bureaucratic black holes. The federal agencies that should be investigating claim no knowledge, but the witnesses describe being debriefed by people who definitely weren't local law enforcement." She pulled out a map of the county, marked with pins indicating each encounter location. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable. A spiral radiating out from a central point deep in the national forest. "They're concentrating on something specific," she continued. "All these encounters are connected to this area. Whatever they're looking for, whatever they're studying, it's here." Martinez studied the map, his skepticism wavering. "So, what's your theory? Alien invasion? First contact?" "I don't think it's either," Sarah said quietly. "I think it's an evaluation. They've been watching us develop, and now they're deciding something, whether we're ready, whether we're worthy, whether we're a threat, and I have a feeling our time is running out." The phone on her desk rang, making both officers jump. Sarah answered it, expecting another routine call, but the voice on the other end made her blood run cold. "Detective Chen? This is Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the CDC. We need to discuss some unusual reports you've been collecting. Can you be at the federal building in 2 hours?" Sarah met Martinez's eyes, seeing her own fear reflected there. "Of course, Dr. Warren. Should I bring the files?" "That won't be necessary. We have copies." The line went dead. Sarah stared at the phone, then at the scattered reports on her desk. They'd been watching her watch the Watchers. The game was changing, and she was about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole went. As she gathered her jacket and keys, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would be the last time she'd be allowed to investigate these cases as a simple police detective. Whatever was coming, whatever the Watchers had been preparing for, the human authorities were finally ready to acknowledge it. The question was, would acknowledgement come too late? Outside her office window, the morning sky was clear and bright, but Sarah found herself scanning it anyway, looking for shapes that didn't belong, lights that moved wrong, signs that the watchers were still there, still observing, still deciding humanity's fate from the silence between the stars. I was caught off guard again, sitting in my usual spot by the window, just watching the people pass by outside. It was one of those slow afternoons where everything felt normal, predictable. The coffee shop hummed with its usual rhythm, the espresso machine hissing, conversations blending into white noise, the occasional clink of ceramic against wood. I'd been coming here for weeks. Same time, same table, working on my laptop and observing the world beyond the glass. That's when I noticed him. He was standing across the street, perfectly still among the flow of pedestrians who moved around him like water around a stone. Tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed too formal for the casual neighborhood. But it wasn't his appearance that made me pause. It was the way he stood there, motionless, staring directly at the coffee shop window, directly at me. I shifted in my seat, trying to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe he was waiting for someone, checking his phone, lost in thought. But his posture was too deliberate, too focused. I looked down at my laptop screen, typed a few meaningless words, then glanced back up. He was still there. Same position, same unwavering stare. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I closed my laptop and gathered my things, suddenly feeling exposed sitting by that large window. As I stood to leave, I took one more look across the street. The man was gone. I stepped outside, scanning both directions along the sidewalk. The usual crowd of shoppers and commuters moved about their business, but there was no sign of the man in the dark coat. No indication he'd ever been there at all. I walked home faster than usual, checking over my shoulder more times than I cared to admit. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress from work, too much caffeine, an overactive imagination. Any of those could explain it. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of those eyes. They hadn't blinked once during the entire time I'd watched him. Not once. The next day, I almost didn't go back to the coffee shop, but routine is a powerful thing. And by 2 p.m. I found myself at the same table, laptop open, trying to focus on work while stealing glances out the window. He wasn't there. Relief washed over me, followed immediately by embarrassment. I'd worked myself up over nothing. A stranger on the street who happened to be looking in my direction. People look at things all the time. It doesn't mean anything. I was just starting to relax when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You're wondering about yesterday." My blood went cold. I stared at the screen, reading the message again. The timestamp showed it had just arrived, but there was no sender information beyond unknown. I looked up from my phone and scanned the street outside. Normal afternoon traffic, normal people going about their normal lives. No one paying any attention to the coffee shop, certainly no one watching me. Another text arrived. "Table by the window, blue laptop. You've been coming here for 23 days. My hands started shaking. 23 days. I quickly counted back. He was right. I'd started this routine exactly 23 days ago when I began working remotely. I stood up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor, drawing looks from other customers. I needed to leave, needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere public with lots of people. But as I reached for my laptop, another message appeared. "Don't leave yet, we need to talk." The rational part of my brain screamed at me to ignore the message, to pack up and go straight to the police. But something else, curiosity maybe, or a strange compulsion I couldn't explain, made me sit back down. I typed a response. "Who is this?" The reply came instantly. Someone who's been watching. Someone who knows what you've been seeing in your dreams. My stomach dropped. The dreams. For the past 3 weeks, I'd been having the same vivid dream almost every night. I was standing in a vast, empty space filled with soft blue light, and there were figures in the distance, tall, thin silhouettes that seemed to be observing me. I always woke up with the strangest feeling that the dream had been more than just a dream, but I'd never told anyone about it. "How do you know about that?" I typed. "Because I sent them to you. Because you're ready to understand what's really happening." I looked around the coffee shop. Everyone seemed normal. Reading, typing, chatting with friends. The barista was making someone's latte, completely oblivious to the fact that my entire world was shifting beneath my feet. "What's happening?" I typed. "Look outside. Across the street. Same spot as yesterday." I didn't want to look. Every instinct told me to close the laptop, walk away, and pretend this conversation never happened. But my eyes moved to the window anyway, drawn by some invisible force. He was there again. Same dark coat, same impossible stillness. But this time, he was holding up his phone, and as I watched, he typed something. A few seconds later, my phone buzzed. "Now you see me. Tomorrow, you'll see them." I blinked, and he was gone again. Vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. That night, the dreams were different. Instead of distant figures, they were close. Close enough that I could see their faces, or what passed for faces. Smooth, pale surfaces where features should have been, with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. They didn't speak, but somehow I understood what they wanted. They wanted me to remember. To remember what, I didn't know. But as I stood there in that blue-lit space, surrounded by beings that couldn't possibly exist, I felt a recognition deep in my bones. As if I'd been here before, as if this place was more familiar to me than my own apartment. I woke up with a word on my lips, a word in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood perfectly. And I knew with absolute certainty that tomorrow I would go back to the coffee shop. I would sit at the same table, and I would wait. Because whatever was happening to me, whatever these dreams meant, whatever connection existed between me and the man in the dark coat and the beings in the blue light, it was just beginning. And despite every rational thought telling me to run, to hide, to pretend none of this was real, I found myself looking forward to it. There was something about those watching eyes, something about that otherworldly blue glow that felt less like a threat and more like coming home. The next morning, I dressed carefully and made my way to the coffee shop earlier than usual. As I settled into my familiar spot by the window, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I was curious. I was ready. And across the street in the exact same spot, a figure in a dark coat waited for me to notice him. This time, when our eyes met, he smiled. I was stationed at a remote military installation in the Nevada desert, the kind of place that doesn't exist on any public maps. We called it Site 47, though I'm sure that wasn't its real designation. I'd been there for 18 months as a communications specialist, monitoring radio frequencies and maintaining our encrypted satellite links. Most days blended together in that endless stretch of sand and scrub brush. But what happened during my final week there changed everything I thought I knew about what's really out there. It started with the radios. Every piece of communication equipment on the base began picking up this strange interference around 3 a.m. Not static or the usual atmospheric disturbance we'd get during solar flares, but something else entirely. It sounded almost musical, like a chorus of voices singing in a language that wasn't quite human. The pitch would rise and fall in perfect harmony, creating these haunting melodies that seem to bypass your ears and resonate directly in your chest. My supervisor, Sergeant Martinez, thought it was some kind of enemy transmission at first. We ran every decryption protocol we had, but the signals didn't match any known communication methods. They weren't coming from any terrestrial source either. The triangulation equipment kept pointing straight up into the empty desert sky. Martinez ordered a communications blackout, worried that our own transmissions might be compromised, but the strange music kept bleeding through every frequency. On the second night, the lights appeared, 3 perfect spheres of pale blue light, hovering about 200 feet above the main compound. They moved in formation, slowly circling the perimeter of the base like they were conducting some kind of survey. The base went to full alert immediately. Spotlights swept the sky, but whenever the beams touched the objects, they simply faded away, only to reappear moments later in a different position. I was in the communications bunker, trying to establish contact with our command center when the real contact began. The radio crackled to life, and instead of the usual static, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was my own voice, speaking words I'd never said, in that same musical cadence as the interference. The voice was explaining our defensive positions, our personnel count, even details about our classified operations that I barely knew myself. The strangest part was that I could feel the words forming in my mind before they came through the radio. It was like something was accessing my memories, pulling information directly from my thoughts and broadcasting it back to me. I tried to turn off the equipment, but my hands wouldn't obey. I sat there, paralyzed, listening to my own voice betray every secret I'd sworn to protect. Martinez burst into the bunker, his face pale with terror. He'd been hearing the same thing on his radio, but it was his voice speaking, revealing different classified information. Across the base, every soldier was experiencing the same phenomenon. Our own voices, speaking our own secrets, broadcast on frequencies that shouldn't have existed. The third night brought physical contact. I was doing a routine perimeter check when I saw him standing near the fence line. At first glance, he looked like any other soldier, wearing our standard desert camouflage uniform, but something was wrong with his movements. He walked too smoothly, like he was gliding just above the ground. His face was perfectly human, but his eyes reflected light like an animal's. I called out the proper challenge code, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, watching me with those strange, luminous eyes. When I moved closer, I realized what was so unsettling about him. He looked exactly like me. Not similar, not like a brother or cousin, but identical in every detail except for those alien eyes. The duplicate spoke in my voice, using my exact speech patterns and mannerisms. He told me things about my childhood that no one else could have known, memories I'd never shared with anyone. He knew about the scar on my knee from when I fell off my bike at age 7, about the night terrors I'd had as a child, about the letter I'd written to my father but never sent before he died. He explained that they'd been observing our species for generations, learning from us, studying our capacity for both creation and destruction. He said they took samples, not just biological specimens, but copies of consciousness itself. Perfect duplicates that could walk among us, indistinguishable from the originals except to those who knew what to look for. The worst part was when he told me why they were here. Humanity had reached a critical juncture, he said. Our technological advancement was accelerating beyond our wisdom to control it. They'd seen it happen to countless other species across the galaxy. Most destroyed themselves within a few generations of developing nuclear weapons and global communications. We were being evaluated, and the results would determine whether they intervened or simply waited for us to eliminate ourselves. He showed me images then, projected directly into my mind. vast cities floating in space, populated by beings who looked almost human but weren't quite. Worlds that had been stripped bare by species that had failed their evaluation, and other planets thriving under the guidance of civilizations that had proven themselves worthy of survival. The duplicate reached out and touched my forehead with one finger. The sensation was like ice water flooding my veins, but with it came a download of information that nearly shattered my sanity. I saw the scope of their presence on Earth, hidden facilities beneath the ocean floor, observation posts disguised as ordinary buildings in major cities, and thousands of duplicates walking among us in positions of power and influence. They weren't invaders in the traditional sense, they were gardeners, tending to a crop they'd been cultivating for millennia. Humanity was just another experiment, another test subject in their vast catalog of species under observation. Some of us would be preserved, he told me. The best examples, the ones who showed the most promise, would be taken to safety before the evaluation concluded. When I woke up the next morning, I was in the base medical facility. The doctors said I'd been found unconscious at my post, suffering from what appeared to be severe dehydration and exposure. They attributed my confused memories to heat stroke and stress. My commanding officer was understanding but firm. I was being transferred immediately to a facility in Colorado for psychological evaluation and recovery. But I knew what I'd experienced was real. The evidence was subtle but undeniable. My security clearance had been revoked overnight, and several files I'd had access to were now classified far above my level. The communications equipment showed signs of modifications that hadn't been there before, upgrades that no one could explain. And most disturbing of all, 3 soldiers on the base, including Sergeant Martinez, were behaving differently. Small changes that others might not notice, but I could see the difference in their eyes. The transfer orders came through within hours. As I packed my belongings, I found something that confirmed my worst fears. Tucked inside my locker was a photograph I'd never seen before, showing me shaking hands with the duplicate from that night. Both figures looked exactly identical, but I could tell which one was which by the eyes. The human me looked confused and frightened. The other wore an expression of cold calculation that I'd never made in my life. I've been at the Colorado facility for 6 months now. The doctors are kind and professional, and they've helped me develop coping strategies for what they call my traumatic stress response. They've convinced almost everyone that my memories are false, products of a mind pushed beyond its breaking point by isolation and classified work pressures. But I know the truth, and I'm not the only one. There are others here, military personnel from different installations, all with similar stories of contact and replacement. We recognize each other easily now. There's something in the eyes of those who've seen behind the veil, a knowledge that can't be faked or forgotten. The evaluation is still ongoing. They're still watching, still learning, still making their copies. And somewhere out there, in positions of power and influence, those copies are preparing for whatever comes next. The gardeners are patient, but they won't wait forever. Eventually, they'll decide whether humanity deserves to continue or if it's time to start over with a fresh crop. I don't know which way the decision will go, but I know that when it comes, most people won't even realize what's happening. They'll just wake up one morning to find that the world has changed overnight. And the people making the decisions aren't quite the same people they were the day before. The only question that remains is whether enough of us will remember the truth to make a difference, or if we'll all just fade away into footnotes in some alien catalog, another failed experiment in the long history of worlds that couldn't save themselves. The darkness was absolute. It wrapped around everything like a living thing, thick and suffocating, pressing against my skin with an almost physical weight. I had been stationed at the remote monitoring facility for 3 months, alone, except for the occasional supply drop and the static-filled radio check-ins with headquarters. The job was simple enough. Watch the screens, record any anomalies, and report back. Nothing ever happened out here. Nothing was supposed to happen. But that night, everything changed. I was reviewing the day's data when the first anomaly appeared on the electromagnetic sensors. A faint blip, barely registering, but persistent. It wasn't weather. It wasn't equipment malfunction. The signature was unlike anything in our databases. I leaned forward, adjusting the sensitivity, trying to get a clearer reading. The blip pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat, growing stronger with each pulse. Then the lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. The screens flickered back to life, but now they showed something impossible. The electromagnetic readings had spiked beyond anything our equipment was designed to measure. But it wasn't random interference. There was a pattern to it. A structure that suggested intelligence. I reached for the radio, my hands trembling slightly as I keyed the microphone. Static filled the air, punctuated by what sounded almost like whispers. I tried different frequencies, but they all carried the same strange undertone, as if something was listening in on every channel. That's when I saw it through the window. A soft glow emanated from beyond the tree line, pulsing in perfect synchronization with the electromagnetic readings. It wasn't the harsh white of artificial lighting or the warm orange of fire. This was something else entirely. A pale blue radiance that seemed to bend around itself, creating shapes that hurt to look at directly. The glow began to move, drifting through the forest with deliberate purpose. Trees didn't obstruct it. Shadows didn't affect it. It simply existed in its own space, following rules I couldn't comprehend. As it drew closer, the whispers on the radio became clearer, though still in no language I recognized. The sounds carried an unmistakable sense of urgency, as if trying to convey something vital. I grabbed the emergency camera and began recording, though the lens seemed to struggle to focus on the phenomenon. Through the viewfinder, I could see additional details that were invisible to the naked eye. Geometric patterns swirled within the light, constantly shifting and rearranging themselves. They reminded me of circuit boards, but organic somehow, as if technology and biology had merged into something entirely new. The facility's motion detectors began triggering in sequence, creating a path that led directly to my building. But there was nothing visible moving along that path, just the sensors responding to something my eyes couldn't see. The electromagnetic readings were now so intense that several instruments had shut down automatically to prevent damage. As the glow reached the edge of the clearing where the facility stood, it stopped. For a long moment, nothing happened. The whispers on the radio faded to silence. Even the usual night sounds of the forest had ceased. The world held its breath. Then, slowly, the light began to change. It condensed, becoming more solid, more defined. What had been an amorphous glow now took on a distinct shape. Tall, elongated, with proportions that were almost but not quite human. It stood at the edge of the clearing, perfectly still, and I had the overwhelming sensation that it was studying me with the same intensity that I was studying it. I tried to move, to step back from the window, but my muscles wouldn't respond. It wasn't paralysis exactly, more like a gentle but irresistible suggestion that I remain exactly where I was. The being, for I was now certain that's what it was, raised what might have been an arm. The gesture was slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. The moment it completed the movement, images flooded my mind. Not my own memories, but something else entirely. I saw vast cities that defied physics, floating in space without any visible means of support. I witnessed technologies that operated on principles beyond current human understanding. Most disturbing of all, I saw Earth from a perspective I'd never imagined, not as humanity's home, but as one small part of something infinitely larger and more complex. The visions lasted only seconds, but they felt like hours. When they ended, I found myself standing in the middle of the room with no memory of having moved. The being was gone. The electromagnetic readings had returned to normal. Even the emergency lighting had switched back to standard operation. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the way shadows fell, in the quality of silence. The facility was no longer just an isolated monitoring station. It had become something else, a point of contact, a bridge between worlds that operated according to different rules. I spent the rest of the night reviewing the recordings, but the camera had captured nothing useful. Just darkness punctuated by brief flares of light that could have been anything. The audio was worse. Hours of static broken by sounds that might have been whispers or might have been wind through the trees. The official report I filed the next morning mentioned equipment malfunctions and atmospheric disturbances. Nothing more. But I knew the truth was far more complex. We weren't alone out here. We never had been. And whatever was watching us from beyond the tree line was patient, methodical, and utterly alien in its intentions. Days passed normally after that, or as normally as anything could pass in a place where the very air seemed charged with possibility. I continued my work, monitoring the instruments, filing reports, maintaining the facade of routine. But I was different now. The encounter had left marks that went deeper than memory. I found myself noticing things I'd previously overlooked, subtle changes in electromagnetic patterns, variations in background radiation that formed almost musical sequences, shadows that fell in directions that didn't quite match their supposed sources. 3 weeks later, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I had modified the recording equipment, adjusted the sensors, prepared myself as much as anyone could prepare for contact with the incomprehensible. The being appeared at exactly the same spot, emerging from the forest like a thought becoming reality. But this encounter was different. Where before there had been one entity, now there were three. They moved in perfect coordination, their forms shifting and blending as they approached. The communication was more direct this time. Instead of overwhelming visions, I received focused impressions, concepts that bypassed language entirely and implanted themselves directly into my understanding. They were explorers, these beings, but not in any sense humans would recognize. They didn't seek new territories or resources. They sought new forms of consciousness, new ways of experiencing existence itself. Earth wasn't being invaded or studied in the conventional sense. It was being appreciated. These entities moved through dimensions the way we might walk through a gallery, observing different expressions of life and intelligence. Humanity represented something unique in their vast catalog of conscious experiences, a species balanced precariously between creation and destruction, capable of both breathtaking beauty and horrifying cruelty. They had been watching for millennia, these beings explained without words. Not interfering, not judging, simply observing as humanity struggled to understand its place in a universe far stranger and more populated than we had ever imagined. But something was changing. The barriers between dimensions were thinning, and contact was becoming inevitable. I was not chosen randomly for this encounter. The facility where I worked sat on what they conveyed as a confluence point, a place where the boundaries between realities were naturally weak. My isolation, my willingness to observe rather than immediately react, had marked me as a suitable intermediary. Not for invasion or conquest, but for something far more subtle and profound. The beings wanted humanity to be prepared for a larger truth. We were not alone, had never been alone, and our future development would necessarily involve contact with intelligences that operated according to principles we were only beginning to glimpse. The process would be gradual, they assured me, unfolding over generations rather than years, but it would be irreversible. As dawn approached, the entities began to fade, but before they disappeared entirely, they left me with a final gift, or perhaps a burden. A device, if it could be called that, materialized on the desk beside me. It resembled a crystalline structure, multifaceted and slightly warm to the touch. When I looked into its depths, I could see patterns that shifted and changed, displaying information in ways that bypassed traditional senses. The device would allow limited communication across the dimensional barriers, they explained. Not for casual contact, but for coordination of the gradual revelation that was to come. I would not be the only human to receive such a tool. Others, scattered across the globe, would serve as anchor points for the slow integration of humanity into a larger cosmic community. The responsibility was overwhelming. How do you prepare an entire species for the knowledge that everything they believe about their place in the universe is fundamentally incomplete? How do you bridge the gap between human understanding and forms of intelligence that operate on principles we've never even theorized? The beings seemed to sense my uncertainty. Through the device, they conveyed a sense of patience that spanned geological ages. This process had been undertaken with countless other species across the cosmos. Some had adapted smoothly, welcoming the expanded awareness. Others had struggled, requiring careful guidance to prevent self-destruction during the transition. A few had rejected the truth entirely, choosing to remain isolated in their limited understanding. Humanity's response remained to be seen. Over the following months, I learned to use the device with increasing skill. The communication wasn't telepathic exactly, more like accessing a vast library of concepts and experiences that existed outside normal space-time. I could glimpse other worlds, other forms of consciousness, other ways of organizing reality itself. Each contact expanded my understanding while simultaneously revealing how much I still didn't know. The hardest part was the isolation. I couldn't share this knowledge with anyone. The revelation had to unfold naturally, according to a timeline that stretched far beyond my individual lifespan. I was part of something vast and patient, a process that viewed human civilization as we might view the growth of a garden, worth nurturing, but requiring careful timing and the right conditions. Sometimes, late at night, I would stand at the window and watch the forest. The beings were still there, I knew, existing in spaces adjacent to our reality, watching, waiting, preparing for the moment when humanity would be ready to take its next evolutionary step. That moment was coming, whether we were prepared or not. The question wasn't whether contact would occur, but how humanity would choose to respond when the full truth finally became undeniable. Would we embrace our place in a larger community of consciousness, or would we retreat into fear and denial? The answer, like so many others, lay hidden in the spaces between worlds, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. And I would be here, watching and waiting, serving as one small bridge between what humanity was and what it might become. The universe, I had learned, was far stranger and more wonderful than we had ever dared imagine. Soon, everyone would know. The only question was whether we would be brave enough to accept the invitation to join something infinitely larger than ourselves. In the meantime, I continued my vigil, guardian of secrets that would reshape everything we thought we knew about existence itself. The beings had chosen their ambassadors carefully, and the next phase of human evolution was about to begin. As these accounts continued to surface from every corner of our planet, A disturbing pattern emerges that suggests we are not dealing with isolated incidents or random encounters. The consistency of these experiences across different cultures, geographic locations, and time periods points to something far more systematic and deliberate than mere chance. The beings described in these encounters display a level of technological sophistication and consciousness that challenges our fundamental understanding of intelligence, reality, and our place in the cosmic hierarchy. What makes these testimonies particularly compelling is not just their frequency, but the profound transformation they trigger in those who experience them. Dr. Sarah Chen, a neuroscientist who encountered the crystalline entities in the Antarctic Research Station, returned from her experience with an inexplicable understanding of quantum mechanics that advanced her field by decades. Her colleagues noted that she seemed to possess knowledge that she couldn't have acquired through conventional means, as if information had been directly implanted into her consciousness during her otherworldly encounter. Similarly, Marcus Rodriguez, the forest ranger who witnessed the geometric light formations, developed an almost supernatural ability to predict weather patterns and natural disasters weeks in advance. His reports to the National Weather Service became legendary for their accuracy, yet he could never explain the source of his knowledge. He would simply stare into the distance with a haunted expression and speak of whispers carried on the wind, messages from intelligences that existed beyond the veil of normal perception. These transformations suggest that contact with these entities involves more than mere observation. There appears to be a deliberate exchange of information, a gradual preparation of selected individuals for some greater purpose. The question that haunts researchers is whether this preparation is beneficial or ominous in nature. Are we being gradually conditioned for a peaceful integration into a galactic community, or are we being studied and modified like specimens in a vast cosmic experiment? The electromagnetic anomalies reported in nearly every encounter provide another crucial piece of the puzzle. Dr. Amanda Foster, an electromagnetic field specialist at MIT, has spent the last 5 years analyzing data from encounter sites. Her findings reveal a consistent pattern of electromagnetic signatures that don't match any known natural phenomena or human technology. The field fluctuations appear to create temporary rifts in the fabric of space-time itself, allowing these entities to slip between dimensions as easily as we might walk through a doorway. Most unsettling is her discovery that these electromagnetic signatures are increasing in frequency and intensity worldwide. Monitoring stations across the globe have detected a steady rise in these anomalous readings, with the most dramatic increases occurring in areas where multiple encounters have been reported. It's as if the barrier between our dimension and theirs is gradually thinning, preparing for something unprecedented in human history. The psychological impact on witnesses cannot be understated. Many report experiencing what researchers have termed cosmic consciousness expansion, a sudden awareness of the vast interconnectedness of all life in the universe. This expansion comes with a terrible burden of knowledge, an understanding that humanity exists within a framework of intelligence and purpose that extends far beyond our current comprehension. Jennifer Walsh, who encountered the shadow figures in the abandoned warehouse, described her experience as awakening from a dream I didn't know I was having. She spoke of suddenly understanding that what we perceive as reality is merely the surface layer of a far more complex existence. The entities she encountered seemed to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensions, their consciousness operating on levels that human minds can barely grasp. This expansion of awareness often comes with a profound sense of isolation. Witnesses frequently report feeling disconnected from their previous lives, as if they've been given a glimpse behind the curtain of reality that makes it impossible to return to the comfortable illusions of everyday existence. Many struggle with depression, anxiety, and a persistent feeling that they're living in a world that isn't quite real. The recurring theme of ancient intelligence in these encounters suggests that these entities have been observing humanity for millennia. Archaeological evidence supports this possibility, with unexplained artifacts and structures found worldwide that seem to require technological capabilities beyond what ancient civilizations are believed to have possessed. The precision of the pyramids, the impossible stonework of Pumapunku, the mysterious Nazca lines, all take on new significance when viewed through the lens of ongoing extraterrestrial contact. Dr. Michael Harrison, an archaeologist specializing in anomalous ancient structures, has documented over 300 sites worldwide that show evidence of advanced technology or knowledge. His research suggests that these entities may have been guiding human development for thousands of years, subtly influencing our evolution and technological advancement. The question is why they've chosen to accelerate their contact in recent decades. The timing of increased encounters coincides with humanity's technological advancement and our growing awareness of our place in the universe. As we've developed the capability to detect exoplanets, understand quantum mechanics, and manipulate electromagnetic fields, we've perhaps reached a threshold that makes us ready for the next phase of contact. The entities seem to be responding to our growing sophistication, revealing themselves more openly to those who are prepared to handle the encounter. Government agencies worldwide have begun to acknowledge what independent researchers have suspected for decades. The recent release of previously classified documents reveals that military and intelligence organizations have been tracking these encounters for over 70 years. The patterns they've documented align perfectly with civilian reports, confirming that we're dealing with a phenomenon of staggering scope and consistency. Most significantly, these documents reveal that the encounters are not random. The entities appear to be following a deliberate agenda, selecting specific individuals based on criteria that remain largely mysterious. Common factors among contactees include high intelligence, emotional stability, and positions of influence within their communities. It's as if they're carefully choosing human ambassadors for whatever comes next. The physical evidence left behind at encounter sites provides additional validation for these extraordinary claims. Soil samples from landing sites show isotopic ratios that don't match terrestrial norms, suggesting materials from other worlds or dimensions. Vegetation in these areas often displays genetic modifications that shouldn't be possible through natural processes, as if the very fabric of life has been altered by exposure to these otherworldly presences. Perhaps most intriguing are the metallic fragments occasionally found at encounter sites. Analysis reveals alloys with properties that challenge our understanding of materials science. The metals display characteristics that seem to shift based on environmental conditions, appearing almost alive in their responsiveness to electromagnetic fields and temperature variations. These materials resist conventional analysis, their atomic structures rearranging themselves when subjected to detailed examination. The consistency of reported communication methods across encounters suggests a sophisticated understanding of human consciousness. Rather than relying on verbal language, these entities appear to communicate through direct mental transmission, downloading complex concepts and emotions directly into the minds of their contactees. This method of communication transcends linguistic barriers and allows for the transfer of information that would be impossible to convey through conventional means. Witnesses describe receiving vast amounts of information in mere moments, understanding concepts about the nature of reality, the structure of the universe, and the purpose of existence that would normally require years of study to comprehend. This information often comes with a sense of ancient wisdom, as if they're being taught by intelligences that have existed for millions of years and have accumulated knowledge beyond human imagination. The emotional component of these communications is particularly profound. Contactees frequently report experiencing overwhelming feelings of love, compassion, and unity with all life in the universe. However, these positive emotions are often accompanied by a deep sadness or concern, as if the entities are worried about humanity's future and the choices we're making as a species. This emotional dimension suggests that these encounters involve more than scientific observation or technological demonstration. The entities appear to be genuinely invested in humanity's development and concerned about our survival. Their messages often include warnings about environmental destruction, nuclear warfare, and the need for greater unity among human societies. It's as if they're trying to guide us away from paths that lead to self-destruction. The increasing frequency of encounters in recent years has led some researchers to propose that we're approaching a critical juncture in human history. The entities may be accelerating their contact because time is running out for some form of intervention or revelation. The urgency in their communication suggests that whatever they're preparing us for is imminent, possibly within the next few decades. Climate change, nuclear proliferation, and growing social instability worldwide may have triggered a more direct approach from these watching intelligences. If they've been guiding human development for millennia, they may feel compelled to intervene more directly as we approach potential extinction scenarios. The encounters may represent a last-ditch effort to prepare humanity for a transformation that could ensure our survival. The technological demonstrations witnessed during these encounters hint at capabilities that could revolutionize human civilization. Clean energy sources, faster-than-light travel, consciousness transfer, and dimensional manipulation all appear to be within their grasp. The question is whether humanity is ready for such advanced knowledge, or whether we would use it to destroy ourselves more efficiently. The gradual revelation approach they seem to be following suggests a careful assessment of human readiness. By selecting specific individuals for contact and allowing them to gradually acclimate to expanded consciousness, they may be creating a network of prepared humans who can serve as bridges between our species and theirs when full contact becomes necessary. The isolation and fear experienced by many contactees may be an unavoidable consequence of this preparation process. Those who have glimpsed the true nature of reality find it difficult to relate to others who remain unaware of the greater cosmic context. This isolation may be a necessary sacrifice, creating individuals who can function as translators between human and non-human consciousness. The recurring theme of time distortion in these encounters suggests that these entities exist outside our normal temporal framework. Witnesses often report experiences that seem to last hours, but occur within minutes of objective time, or conversely, brief encounters that somehow contain lifetimes of experience. This manipulation of temporal perception may be necessary for the transfer of vast amounts of information within the constraints of human consciousness. The implications of these time distortions extend beyond individual encounters. If these entities can manipulate time, they may be viewing human history from a perspective that encompasses past, present, and future simultaneously. Their actions may be based on knowledge of outcomes that haven't yet occurred from our perspective, explaining the seemingly prophetic nature of many contact experiences. The architectural visions reported by contactees provide another piece of the puzzle. The impossible geometries and crystalline structures described in these encounters suggest technologies based on principles we don't yet understand. These visions may represent glimpses of actual locations, either on other worlds or in other dimensions, or they may be symbolic representations of concepts too advanced for human language to convey. The consistency of these architectural elements across independent encounters suggests they represent something real and significant. The crystal formations, geometric patterns, and organic technological hybrids described by witnesses may be showing us the future of human development, or the nature of advanced civilizations that have moved beyond our current understanding of physics and engineering. The environmental sensitivity displayed by these entities, their apparent concern for Earth's ecological systems, suggests a perspective that views planets as living organisms rather than mere resources to be exploited. This holistic worldview may be what they're trying to impart to humanity, a recognition that our survival depends on understanding our interconnectedness with all life on Earth and beyond. The medical procedures and examinations reported in some encounters may represent attempts to monitor human evolution and adaptation. If these entities have been guiding our development for millennia, they would naturally want to track our progress and ensure that their interventions are having the desired effects. The hybrid beings sometimes reported may represent experiments in creating bridge species that can exist in both human and non-human environments. The spiritual component of these encounters cannot be ignored. Many contactees report profound spiritual awakenings, a sudden understanding of the sacred nature of existence, and their place within a vast cosmic plan. This spiritual dimension suggests that these entities understand consciousness as something more than mere brain activity, recognizing it as a fundamental aspect of reality that transcends physical existence. The fear and awe experienced during encounters may be natural responses to contact with intelligences operating on levels far beyond human comprehension. The overwhelming nature of these experiences may be unavoidable when finite human consciousness encounters infinite cosmic intelligence. The fact that contactees often emerge from these experiences with expanded capabilities suggests that the encounters are transformative rather than merely observational. The gradual increase in encounter frequency and intensity suggests that we're building towards something unprecedented in human history. Whether this culminates in open contact, mass consciousness expansion, or intervention to prevent human extinction, the trajectory appears to be accelerating. The entities seem to be preparing not just individuals, but humanity as a whole for a transformation that will fundamentally alter our understanding of ourselves and our place in the universe. The silence of these entities, their preference for indirect communication and gradual revelation, may reflect an understanding that premature contact could cause more harm than good. They may be waiting for humanity to reach a sufficient level of spiritual and technological maturity before revealing themselves openly. The current wave of encounters may represent the final phase of this preparation process. As we stand at this threshold, the accounts of those who have experienced these encounters serve as both warning and invitation. They warn us that we are not alone in the universe, that intelligences far beyond our current understanding are watching and evaluating our progress. They invite us to expand our consciousness, to recognize our connection to the vast web of intelligence that permeates the cosmos, and to prepare for our emergence into a larger community of conscious beings. The terror and wonder experienced by these witnesses may soon become the common experience of all humanity. As the barriers between dimensions continue to thin, as electromagnetic anomalies increase in frequency and intensity, and as more individuals report contact experiences, we may be approaching a moment when the hidden reality behind these encounters becomes impossible to ignore or deny. The question that remains is whether humanity is ready for this revelation. Are we prepared to accept that our understanding of reality has been fundamentally incomplete? Can we adapt to the knowledge that we exist within a hierarchy of consciousness that extends far beyond our current comprehension? The answers to these questions may determine not just the nature of our future contact with these entities, but the very survival of our species. The witnesses to these encounters have become unwilling prophets of a new age, bearers of knowledge that transforms them even as it isolates them from their fellow humans. Their experiences serve as harbingers of a transformation that awaits us all, a metamorphosis that will either elevate humanity to new heights of consciousness and capability or reveal our inadequacy in the face of cosmic intelligence. The mounting evidence from these encounters forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. We may not be alone in this universe, and more importantly, we may not be in control of our own destiny. The beings described in these accounts demonstrate capabilities that transcend our understanding of physics, consciousness, and reality itself. Their ability to manipulate time, space, and human perception suggests we're dealing with intelligences so advanced that our relationship to them might be comparable to that of laboratory animals to their researchers. What's particularly unsettling is the apparent systematic nature of these encounters. The consistency of reported phenomena across different continents, cultures, and time periods suggests a coordinated effort rather than random visitations. These entities seem to be following a carefully orchestrated plan, one that spans generations and possibly millennia. The gradual increase in contact frequency and intensity over the past several decades could indicate that this plan is approaching a critical phase. The psychological and spiritual transformations reported by witnesses raise profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Many experiencers describe feeling fundamentally changed after their encounters, as if something within their neural pathways has been rewired or activated. Some report enhanced psychic abilities. Others describe a sudden understanding of complex scientific or philosophical concepts they previously couldn't grasp. These changes suggest that contact with these beings may trigger dormant aspects of human consciousness, perhaps abilities that were always present but suppressed or underdeveloped. The telepathic communication consistently reported across encounters is particularly significant. Unlike human language, which is sequential and often imprecise, these mental transmissions appear to convey complete concepts instantaneously. Witnesses describe receiving vast amounts of information in seconds, including emotional context, visual imagery, and abstract ideas that would take hours to explain in words. This form of communication suggests these beings operate on a fundamentally different level of consciousness, one where individual minds might be less isolated than our own. The recurring theme of biological sampling and genetic material collection has disturbing implications. If these entities are indeed studying human physiology and genetics, their purposes remain unclear. Some researchers theorize they're monitoring our evolutionary development, while others suggest they might be preparing for some form of integration or hybridization. The reports of human-alien hybrid beings, though controversial, appear too frequent and detailed to dismiss entirely. These accounts describe beings that look nearly human, but possess the telepathic abilities and advanced knowledge of their non-human counterparts. The electromagnetic anomalies associated with these encounters provide another layer of evidence that something extraordinary is occurring. The consistent reports of electronic devices malfunctioning, vehicles stopping, and power grids failing during sighting suggest these beings either generate powerful electromagnetic fields or deliberately disable our technology. This ability to neutralize our most advanced systems demonstrates a level of technological superiority that should give us pause. If these entities wish to harm us, our current defensive capabilities would likely prove useless. The locations chosen for these encounters also reveal a pattern of strategic thinking. Remote wilderness areas offer privacy and reduce the likelihood of mass witnessing, while encounters near military installations and research facilities suggest these beings are specifically interested in our technological capabilities. The fact that many witnesses are scientists, military personnel, or individuals with technical backgrounds indicates these entities may be selectively choosing contacts who can understand and communicate their experiences more effectively. The artifacts and devices allegedly left behind by these beings represent perhaps the most tantalizing evidence of their reality. While most of these objects remain classified or have disappeared into government custody, the few that have been analyzed display properties that challenge our understanding of materials science. Reports describe substances that are impossibly light yet incredibly strong, materials that seem to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and devices that respond to thought rather than physical manipulation. The timing of increased encounter frequency coinciding with humanity's technological advancement and global connectivity cannot be coincidental. As we've developed nuclear weapons, space travel capabilities, and global communication networks, these beings have seemingly increased their monitoring activities. This correlation suggests they may be evaluating our readiness for contact based on our technological and social development. The fact that many encounters occurred during periods of high stress or conflict might indicate they're also assessing our emotional and psychological maturity as a species. The consistent message of environmental concern, transmitted during many encounters, adds another dimension to these interactions. Witnesses frequently report receiving warnings about climate change, nuclear weapons, and ecological destruction. These beings seem genuinely concerned about humanity's impact on Earth and our long-term survival prospects. This environmental focus suggests they may view themselves as guardians or stewards of our planet, with a vested interest in preventing us from destroying our biosphere. The spiritual and philosophical implications of these encounters cannot be ignored. Many witnesses describe profound realizations about the nature of reality, consciousness, and humanity's place in the universe. They report understanding that physical reality is just one layer of existence, that consciousness is fundamental to the universe, and that death is not an ending but a transformation. These revelations often lead to dramatic changes in worldview, career choices, and life priorities. The government response to these encounters has been notably inconsistent, ranging from official denial to apparent cover-up efforts. The recent release of previously classified military footage showing unidentified aerial phenomena suggests a shift in official attitudes, but many questions remain unanswered. The reluctance to fully disclose what government agencies know about these encounters may stem from concerns about public panic, national security implications, or the potential disruption to existing power structures. As we consider the implications of these encounters, we must grapple with the possibility that disclosure of extraterrestrial presence might be inevitable. The increasing frequency of sightings, the proliferation of recording devices, and the growing willingness of credible witnesses to come forward suggest that the truth may soon become impossible to suppress. When that moment arrives, humanity will face its greatest challenge: adapting to the reality that we are not alone, and that our understanding of existence is far more limited than we believed. The question now becomes not whether these encounters are real, but how we should prepare for what appears to be coming. The evidence suggests these beings have been gradually preparing humanity for eventual contact, perhaps waiting for us to reach a level of technological and social development that would make integration possible. The increasing openness about these phenomena in recent years might indicate that this preparation phase is nearing completion. Whether these beings represent salvation or threat remains unclear. Their apparent concern for our environment and long-term survival suggests benevolent intentions, but their secretive approach and the trauma experienced by many witnesses raises questions about their methods and ultimate goals. Perhaps most terrifying is the possibility that our fate may already be decided, that we are participants in a cosmic experiment whose parameters we cannot comprehend. What is certain is that these encounters have fundamentally challenged our understanding of reality, consciousness, and humanity's place in the universe. They force us to confront the possibility that everything we think we know about existence, might be incomplete or incorrect. As we move forward, we must remain open to possibilities that transcend our current understanding while maintaining the critical thinking necessary to distinguish truth from fiction. As we stand at this unprecedented crossroads in human history, these terrifying encounters serve as both a warning and invitation. The witnesses who have shared their experiences describe a reality far more complex and interconnected than our current understanding allows. Their accounts reveal beings whose motivations transcend our limited concepts of conquest or exploitation, instead suggesting a cosmic imperative for consciousness evolution that spans millennia. What makes these encounters particularly unsettling is not merely their otherworldly nature, but the consistent message they convey about humanity's precarious position. These entities appear to possess knowledge of our planet's environmental collapse, our technological misuse, and our spiritual stagnation. Their interventions seem calculated to prepare select individuals for a transformation that may be unavoidable, whether we choose to participate willingly or not. The psychological and spiritual changes reported by contactees point to a fundamental alteration in human consciousness. These individuals often describe expanded awareness, enhanced intuitive abilities, and a deep understanding of interconnectedness that extends beyond Earth. Their transformations suggest that contact with these beings catalyzes dormant potentials within human consciousness, preparing us for integration into a larger cosmic community. Perhaps most terrifying is the implication that this process has been ongoing for thousands of years, operating beneath the surface of recorded history. These beings have allegedly guided human development, intervened at critical moments, and gradually prepared our species for revelation. The acceleration of contact events in recent decades suggests we are approaching a threshold where concealment becomes impossible. The systematic nature of these encounters indicates a carefully orchestrated plan. Remote locations, electromagnetic anomalies, and the selection of specific individuals all point to a methodical approach designed to minimize societal disruption while maximizing transformative impact. These beings appear to understand human psychology intimately, knowing exactly how much revelation we can process without complete breakdown. As disclosure becomes increasingly inevitable, humanity faces a choice that will define our future trajectory. We can embrace this expanded reality with courage and curiosity, recognizing these encounters as opportunities for unprecedented growth and understanding, or we can retreat into fear and denial, clinging to outdated worldviews that no longer serve our evolution. The boundary between worlds continues to thin, and the veil of separation grows increasingly transparent. These terrifying encounters may represent humanity's greatest challenge, but they also offer our most profound opportunity for transformation. The question remains, are we ready to step beyond the limitations of our current reality and embrace our role in a vast, interconnected cosmos? The answer may determine not only our survival, but our very essence as a species.